Hello, my name is Joshua Solomon, and this is my final presentation for TV shows and movies in Taiwan. In this presentation, I will be comparing and contrasting the Taiwanese story, Our Times, and the Shakespearean story, The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. To an introduction for the story, Our Times, it is a Taiwanese movie, as stated. It was released in 2018 and was directed by Yu Shen-chen. And the Shakespearean story is The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, which was made in England and was released as a stage play originally in circa 1597. Some research background that I have is that I decided to compare these two stories because after watching Our Times, I noticed several similarities between this story and Romeo and Juliet. Also, I've always adored the tragedy of Shakespeare, and Our Times has always been one of my favorite movies since it was initially introduced by Lin Aixi. I also saw how the romances grew in the Taiwanese movie and how the people surrounding the two were insisting that they stay apart, similarly to Shakespeare's tragedy. And from my sources, I was able to gather the information necessary to compare the two stories. For example, how both ended up unlike the lovers initially intended, but still resulted in their wanted unions, or how all four characters go through tribulations once they begin their relationships. And the three sources I used were the IMDb pages for Our Times, as well as the 1968 release of Romeo and Juliet, as well as an online edition of the Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. A quick summary of the movie Our Times is that an adult Truly Lin remembers her awkward high school romance life when she teamed up with a school delinquent to get the attention of the boy that she likes, with the condition that she helps him get the attention of the girl that he likes. And eventually, emotions grow between the two that leads to a romance. And in this relationship between the school delinquent and Truly, she realizes that she's in control of her life, not her boss or her parents or her husband. And she realizes she doesn't deserve being mistreated by anyone, her boss and husband, for example. And a brief summary of Romeo and Juliet is that two wealthy families in Italy maintain an ancient grudge, often resulting in fights and bloodshed in the streets, until two children, one from each family, fall in love, initially unaware of who the other one is. And they feel that their romance can bury the hatchet that's still held by both their families. And eventually, once their families discover the two in their secret romance, they try to elope and tragically end up dying. However, this does end up burying the hatchet between their two families. Similarities between these two stories include that they involve romance and death, to different degrees, of course. As stated in Romeo and Juliet, both Romeo and Juliet die in the end, whereas in Our Times, a flashback with Taiyu, the school bully that Truly meets, shows that he is dealing with the death of an old friend, which questionably led to him becoming a delinquent. Also, both couples end up together in the end, whether it be in death or continuing their relationship. Another would be that people insist they stay apart, such as in Romeo and Juliet. Both the families and their friends insist that because they're from feuding families, they can't possibly maintain a relationship with each other. And in our times, Truly's family and friends and teachers insist that she, as a good student, should stay as far away as possible from Taiyu, the bully, or the school delinquent, who was a bad student. Another would be that their unification is revolutionary. As said, in our times, Truly being told again and again to stay away from this bad student, but still growing a relationship with him eventually leads to her taking charge of her life and becoming more independent. Whereas the relationship in Romeo and Juliet eventually leads to the end of a long-time family feud. Another would be both couples were in their teens, such as in Romeo and Juliet. Romeo was 17 and Juliet was 13, whereas in our times, both Truly and Taiyu were in their freshman year of high school, so 14, 15. And lastly, both relations had beneficial results, such as in Romeo and Juliet, it ended the long-time family strife, and in our times, it led to Truly taking charge of her life and not allowing others to push her around, like her husband or her boss. And the differences between the two stories include, first of all, that the lovers got married in Romeo and Juliet, whereas in the end of our times, it only resulted in Truly and Taiyu re-meeting and continuing the relationship from where they left off 20 years in the past. In Romeo and Juliet's relationship, it progressed extremely quickly, going from them meeting to them marrying in less than a couple of weeks. Whereas in our times, as stated, it went from Truly and Taiyu meeting and then their relationship growing over a year, and then it took until they re-met for their relationship to further grow into what can only be assumed a true love at the end of the movie. Also, both in our times aimed to help the other start a relationship with somebody else, their own crushes, whereas in Romeo and Juliet, the two liked each other from the start. Also, the times these stories were set in differs in centuries, whereas in Romeo and Juliet, it took place in the Middle Ages, whereas our times took place in late 1900s or 1990s, early 2000s. And lastly, Romeo and Juliet die at the end, whereas Truly and Taiyu re-meet in the end and continue their relationship. In conclusion, I found that the story in our times can be equated to a Romeo and Juliet tale, but of different kind. Instead of being a tragedy through and through, it ended positively. And, in my opinion, both these stories help to teach how the people in our lives around us can have an effect on our life, for better or for worse. and leaving you with two questions. One, do you think truly made the right choice in the conclusion of Our Times, and why? And two, do you see any other similarities or differences between the two stories, Our Times and the Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet? Please explain. And here are my resources. Thank you for being here for my final presentation.